Frank Moore, 28 AD, had always prided himself on the meticulous way he poured a latte. Standing behind the espresso machine at Lakeview Cafe in Chicago, he placed the porcelain cup beneath the portafilter, dark hair falling into his eyes as he focused. With a quick flick of his wrist, he released a perfect shot of espresso, its nutty aroma filling the air. His brown eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he carefully steamed the milk, crafting an intricate fern pattern on the surface. It was these small, artful touches that set Frank apart. Despite being perpetually short on time, he never cut corners when it came to quality. This morning was no different, except for the chilling gusts of wind battering the cafe's front windows. A sudden cold snap had swept across Chicago, but inside Lakeview Cafe, the comforting scent of coffee and warm pastries cocooned patrons from the frigid outdoors. Darlene, his colleague, called him over with a quick wave. She was 52, wore her grey hair in a neat bob, and possessed a laugh so bright it seemed to bounce off every wall. "Frank, honey," she said, patting his shoulder, "you've got that espresso perfection down to a science, but you can't do it all." "You look like you didn't sleep a wink." Frank suppressed a yawn. Between his morning classes at the Chicago Culinary Institute, the afternoon shift here at the cafe, and his evening gig as a kitchen assistant at Bellini's, rest had become a luxury. But he forced a grin. "I'm just trying to keep up, Darlene. Bills don't pay themselves." She shook her head in concern. "Don't forget you're only human. We worry about you." "Thanks," he replied, tightening his apron strings. "But I'm okay, really." It was a refrain Frank repeated often, yet he couldn't escape the nagging thought that time was against him. After his parents' tragic accident when he was 15, his uncle Marcus had taken him in, guiding him through his teens and encouraging his love of cooking. Now Marcus, at 61, lived with arthritis that forced him out of the professional kitchen. Frank felt an even greater responsibility to succeed, to honor the memory of his parents and his uncle's dreams. Sometime mid-afternoon, when the cafe's rush had subsided, Frank used the brief lull to check his phone. A new email notification flashed across the screen. Rent increase notice. Immediately his stomach tightened. Glancing at the total amount, he realized his already stretched finances would be pushed even further. Unsure of how he would cover the difference, he squeezed his eyes shut for a moment to steady himself. Darlene caught his frown. "Something wrong, Frank?" He shook his head, stuffing the phone back into his pocket. "Just life giving me a little nudge," he said with a forced half-smile. "Nothing I can't handle." By early evening, Frank's shift ended. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, the sharp wind biting at his cheeks. Tiny flakes of snow swirled in the lamplight. Despite the beautiful hush that settled over the city, Frank's thoughts churned with anxiety about the rent hike. He wished he could share the burden with someone, yet he also knew it was his battle to fight. After a short train ride, he made it to his cramped studio apartment on the outskirts of downtown. The old radiator hissed, providing only minimal comfort against the dropping temperatures. Grateful for any warmth, Frank hung his threadbare jacket on the lone hook by the door and sank onto his worn-out couch. Opening a battered folder, he pulled out sketches of his dream restaurant, a place he called Raisi's, a tribute to the Italian and American roots that shaped him. He'd painstakingly planned every detail: the open-concept kitchen, the communal tables, the seasonal menu spotlighting local farmers. But each estimate, from startup costs to monthly overhead, loomed impossibly large. On a barista and kitchen assistant's salary, saving enough to launch his own establishment felt like chasing a mirage in the desert. Yet, as he ran a fingertip along the penciled lines, a wave of determination surged. He remembered cooking alongside his mother when he was just a boy, her laughter echoing in his ears. Someday, he promised himself, Raíces would come to life. For now, though, he needed to rest, before facing another dawn of classes, shifts, and financial worries that seemed endless. The next morning, Chicago woke to a blanket of snow that glistened under the pale winter sun. A sudden storm had swept through overnight, snarling traffic and delaying trains. Frank shivered as he stepped off the bus near the Chicago Culinary Institute, his breath forming little puffs in the frosty air. Drawing his coat tight, he braced against a gust of wind and trudged carefully through the slippery sidewalks. Upon entering the institute, he headed straight for the demonstration kitchen. Rows of stainless steel workstations gleamed under fluorescent lights. The tall windows looked out onto a stark landscape of snowdrifts and slushy roads. In front of the class stood Madame Laurent, 58, with a formidable presence that matched her stern expression. She wore her salt and pepper hair in a severe bun and carried herself like someone accustomed to command. Renowned for her high standards and minimal praise, she struck genuine fear into the hearts of most students. Frank took his place among the group, heart-pounding. He had stayed up late perfecting his hollandaise recipe for today's challenge. Whenever Madame Laurent performed a tasting, her judgments were swift and often brutal. One by one, students presented their sources. A few earned a terse nod. Others received withering critiques. When Frank's turn came, he approached with care, ladling a spoonful of his hollandaise over a small plate of poached asparagus. His mind buzzed with tension. He recalled every step carefully, from clarifying the butter to whisking the egg yolks over the water bath at just the right temperature. Madame Laurent sampled it silently, her expression impassive. Then, to his surprise, she inclined her head a fraction and pronounced in a clipped tone, "Surprisingly competent, Mr. Moore. You have a delicate hand." Her praise, though faint, lit a spark of pride in Frank. It was more than he'd ever received from her. He managed a small, polite smile and returned to his station, feeling a bit lighter. The rest of class proceeded with far less excitement, but that brief acknowledgement fueled him more than he cared to admit. After class, Madame Laurent pulled him aside. "There is a competition happening at the end of the month," she said, her accent coloring each word decisively. "An opportunity for scholarship money and recognition. You should consider entering." Frank froze. "I don't know, Madame Laurent. I'm spread pretty thin." She arched an eyebrow. "Talent doesn't wait for convenience, Mr. Moore. Think about it." Then she swept away, leaving him blinking in her wake. Outside, the snow had started again, drifting softly around the Institute's grand entrance. Frank spotted Tyler, his best friend, leaning against a pillar. Tyler was 30, an aspiring actor-turned-bartender who always seemed ready with encouragement. His face brightened when he saw Frank. "You look like you saw a ghost," Tyler teased. "Madame Laurent chew you out again?" Frank exhaled a shaky laugh. "Not exactly. She wants me to enter some big cooking contest. Says it has scholarship money attached." Tyler's grin widened. "Dude, that's perfect for you. You need the money and you've got the skill. Remember how you used to get so excited just talking about opening your own place? Now's your shot." A memory surfaced of a young Frank, barely 8, standing on a stool beside his mother. She was stirring a pot of tomato sauce, the sweet aroma filling their small kitchen. He recalled the warmth of her hand guiding his, teaching him to pinch and salt with confidence, explaining how food was love made visible. That abiding passion had grown stronger over time, even after her untimely death. "Well, I'll think it over," Frank replied, uncertain. "You know I doubt myself sometimes, especially with everything on my plate." Tyler patted him on the back. "You underestimate yourself, man. Go for it." Just as Frank was about to respond, a gust of wind whipped across the campus, sending them both hurrying inside to find warmth. The competition suddenly felt more tangible, as if the frigid air itself were pushing him to take the leap. Deep down, he wasn't sure if he feared failure or the possibility of real success. He left for Lakeview Cafe with new questions swirling in his head. Even as the snowfall grew heavier, a flicker of hope nestled in his thoughts. Perhaps, just perhaps, this might be the break he desperately needed. Late that evening, after his shift at the cafe, Frank walked up the creaking stairs to his Uncle Marcus's apartment in Pilsen. The old building smelled of cooking spices and lemon-scented cleaner, the hallway dimly lit by a single overhead bulb. Frank knocked softly, hearing the familiar shuffle of footsteps. Marcus, at 61, answered the door with a welcoming grin, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Come on in, kid," Marcus said, ushering him inside. "I've got leftover stew from Mrs. Rodriguez. She'll be offended if you don't eat." Frank's stomach rumbled in response. "I won't say no to that," he said, slipping off his shoes and setting them by a cluttered shoe rack. The apartment was modest, a small living room adjoining a compact kitchen, the walls adorned with framed photographs of Marcus's days as a chef in various Chicago eateries. They settled at the small kitchen table. Marcus dished out hearty beef stew, the rich aroma mixing with the faint spice of cumin. As Frank ate, he felt a comforting warmth spread from the inside out. "How's that old manager at Bellini's treating you?" Marcus asked, easing himself into a chair. His arthritic knees cracked audibly. Frank shrugged. "Chef Giovanni is, he's Chef Giovanni. I come up with ideas and he takes all the credit, but at least it's a paycheck." Marcus shook his head. "I've known Giovanni for decades. Man never changed, always took more than he gave. You deserve better." He paused, noticing Frank's tired eyes. "How's school and that cafe gig?" A sigh escaped Frank's lips. "They're both fine, but the bills keep stacking up. My rent's going up again next month. I don't know how I'm going to manage." He pushed the stew around on his plate, appetite fading beneath the weight of his worries. Marcus tapped the table gently. "Remember, you don't have to do this alone. We Moors, more Ricci, technically, have always stuck together. Even if my cooking days are mostly behind me, I'm here." Glancing at the older man's gnarled hands, Frank nodded appreciatively. Arthritis had forced Marcus out of his beloved profession, a reminder of how fragile dreams could be. "I know, Uncle. There's a culinary contest coming up, and my professor thinks I should enter. It could help with tuition, maybe help me save for the restaurant." Marcus's eyebrows rose. "You should do it, a chance to showcase your talent. That might open doors for you." Before Frank could respond, a knock on the door announced Mrs. Rodriguez, the 70-year-old widow who lived across the hall. Small and spry, with her hair tied in a neat bun, she bustled in carrying a plastic container. "I brought extra arroz con pollo," she declared in a motherly tone. "Marcus told me Frank was here. That boy needs a good meal." Frank stood, feeling a blush creep over his cheeks. "Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez. You're too kind." She glanced appraisingly at Frank, noticing his threadbare jacket on the coat stand. "Mijo, you need someone to look after you," she remarked, her gentle smile radiating concern. Marcus laughed softly. "He's too busy chasing his dreams, Senora." She patted Frank's shoulder. "Don't let the world wear you down. Keep those dreams alive, but take care of yourself too." Then she excused herself, leaving the comforting sense of her cooking behind. Marcus turned serious once they were alone. "Frank, that coat you're wearing has seen better days." "I've got one I don't use anymore, my old wool coat from my last job. Still in good shape, let me get it." He disappeared into a closet and emerged holding a well-preserved, dark grey coat. "Try it on." Frank slipped into the coat. It fit almost perfectly, shoulders just a bit broad, but warm and solid. "Uncle, I can't." "Don't argue. It's yours," Marcus insisted. "It's not just a coat, it's a reminder. You come from a line of cooks who value heart and family above all else." Frank swallowed hard, touched by the gift. Outside, the wind howled. In that moment, he felt a flicker of hope, bolstered by the silent promise woven into the threads of Marcus's coat. The following evening found Frank in the cramped, bustling kitchen of Bellini's, an Italian restaurant in downtown Chicago. Heat radiated from industrial ovens, and the clang of pots accompanied the rapid-fire chatter of sous chefs. Amid the chaos, Frank stood at his station, finely chopping garlic with practiced speed, his new wool coat hanging safely in the small staff closet. Chef Giovanni, 45 and stocky with a perpetually furrowed brow, oversaw every dish with an iron stare. Though Frank's creative touch infused many of the specials, Giovanni rarely acknowledged his contributions. Tonight's menu featured a new risotto recipe, one Frank had subtly innovated with a citrus zest and a hint of saffron. "Move faster, more," Giovanni snapped, sampling the risotto. "We've got a full house out there." Frank forced himself to remain calm. He'd spent days perfecting the balance of flavors, yet Giovanni would doubtless take the credit. The aroma of lemon mingled with the savory saffron, reminding Frank why he loved the craft despite its challenges. As service progressed, the restaurant's front-of-house manager, a tall, elegant woman in her 50s, entered the kitchen. "Chef Eliza Townsend has arrived," she announced in a hushed tone. "She's sitting at table 6. A ripple of tension swept through the brigade. Eliza Townsend, at 50, was a respected food critic known for her discerning palate and influential reviews. Giovanni's eyes widened. "Make sure she gets that special risotto," he ordered, pointedly glancing at Frank. When the dish was ready, Frank watched anxiously as the servers whisked plates into the dining room. Minutes crawled by, each second thick with anticipation. Finally, the manager returned, leaning in close. Miss Townsend asked if she could thank the person who created the risotto. She called it a breath of bright flavor in a gray winter. Frank's heart soared. Giovanni's face contorted in discomfort. Clearing his throat, the chef muttered, "Well, that's my new recipe. I guess I could go out and talk to her." Before Frank could protest, Giovanni disappeared into the dining area. A pang of resentment gnawed at Frank, but he swallowed it down. Recognition, it seemed, would remain out of reach tonight. Later, as Frank was cleaning down his station, a harried server approached. "Hey, you might want to see this." He handed Frank a slip of paper, a short note from Eliza Townsend. It read, "To the creator of this dish, you have genuine talent. Keep going." Frank's pulse quickened. It wasn't public acclaim, but it was enough to validate his work. He slipped the note into his pocket. He'd treasure this small piece of encouragement, proof that his innovations were worthy. Exhausted, he changed back into his street clothes. Just before leaving, the restaurant's accountant approached him with a cautious expression. "They're reducing the college scholarship portion of your compensation next semester," she explained softly. "Chef Giovanni said your hours have increased, so they can't cover both wages and tuition as before." Frank stared in disbelief. The partial scholarship from Bellini's was the only thing making his course load financially possible. "Isn't there a way to keep it?" he asked, voice tight with desperation. She shook her head apologetically. "It's final, I'm afraid." Anger and disappointment churned inside him. Putting away his coat, he stepped outside into a new wave of bitter cold. The taste of betrayal lingered in the air, overshadowing the praise from Eliza Townsend. Each step through the swirling snow echoed with doubt. Could he really forge his own path in the culinary world if finances continued to collapse beneath him? Walking back to the train station, Frank replayed Madame Laurent's words about the upcoming cooking competition. Perhaps that prize money was his only shot at bridging the financial gap, but the fear of failing, and thus confirming every doubt he'd ever had, pressed heavily on his chest. He reached his apartment well after midnight, mind whirling with questions. Should he focus solely on paying bills or cling to the dream of raíces? Was his hope misplaced in a field dominated by profit-driven personalities like Giovanni? Stripping off his coat, he realized with a pang that the biggest challenges might still be ahead. A week later, well after his shift at Bellini's, Frank made his way toward Union Station. Normally, his train ride home was a simple affair, but this night brought complication. A signal failure had caused a cascade of delays. Snow clung stubbornly to the streets, and the wind cut through layers of clothing like tiny knives. Inside the station's cavernous hall, weary travelers clustered on benches and leaned against walls. Departure boards flashed ominous notices about cancellations and indefinite delays. Frank clutched his bag of cooking notes and rubbed his hands together for warmth, grateful at least for his thick wool coat. Midnight approached. Exhaustion tugged at his eyelids. He scanned the space, searching for any sign of an earlier train. That's when he noticed her. A young woman, probably mid-20s, seated alone near a drafty entrance. She wore an elegant yet insufficient coat, her hands trembling as she tried to text on her phone. Outside, the temperature had dropped rapidly, threatening to dip below zero. Frank hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but the sight of her shivering was too stark to ignore. After a few moments, he walked closer. Her face, partially hidden by a scarf, revealed tired eyes and lightly flushed cheeks. She looked up, startled. "Ma'am, you look like you're freezing," Frank began, timidly. "Do you need another coat or something?" She seemed uncertain, hugging herself for warmth. "I lost my driver, and there are no taxis nearby. My phone died. Guess I'm waiting for morning," she murmured. Her voice was tinged with fatigue and frustration. Frank slid off his wool coat and offered it to her. "Here, at least take this. It's not fancy, but it's warm." She blinked, surprised at his kindness. No, I couldn't possibly." "Please," he insisted gently. "I've got layers underneath. You look like you really need it." He smiled, hoping to ease her discomfort. Reluctantly, she accepted the coat, slipping it on and visibly relaxing as the warmth enveloped her. The coat draped over her slim frame, giving her a slightly comical appearance, but she offered a shy, grateful smile. "Thank you," she said softly, meeting his gaze with piercing green eyes. "I'm Anne, by the way. Anne Murphy." "Frank Moore," he replied, nodding. "It's nice to meet you, despite the circumstances." They spoke briefly. She mentioned missing a ride after a late charity event, and he mentioned working long hours. A battered newspaper lay on the bench beside her, bearing an article about Thomas Murphy, the influential CEO of Murphy Investments. The accompanying photo showed a formal gala scene with a well-dressed man and a young woman who looked strikingly familiar to Anne. Though Frank didn't piece it together, Anne eyed his thin hoodie and frowned. "Look, I can call a taxi for you, if I can get my phone charged. It's freezing." "You shouldn't be out here without your coat," Frank offered a lopsided grin. "I'll be fine. Besides, there's only a few hours until the first morning train. You keep the coat, I insist." She looked as though she wanted to argue, but instead nodded. "At least let me give you something in return," she said, fumbling in her small clutch. "Cash for a cab, or—" Frank held up a hand. "No, honestly. Think of it as a favor someone might have done for me if our roles were reversed. I'm just glad you'll be warmer now." They continued their conversation for another minute, exchanging small details. He was a barista and aspiring chef. She worked in finance. She offered no specifics beyond that. Exhaustion soon weighed on them both. When Anne rose to check on potential taxi options, Frank quietly slipped into the next waiting area. He found a corner seat and dozed off, still warmed by the memory of her smile. A few hours later, he woke to discover that Anne was gone, along with the wool coat he'd been proud to inherit. It didn't matter. Somehow, he felt at peace with his decision. On that frigid night, a simple gesture of kindness was enough to lift his spirits. Little did he know, the choice to lend his coat to a freezing stranger would spark a series of events that would test every resolve he had and introduce him to a world far beyond his modest dreams. Early the next morning, Frank arrived at Lakeview Cafe, still rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He'd managed only a few hours of rest after his long night at Union Station. The cafe buzzed with its usual hum, regulars chatting in line, espresso machines hissing, and Darlene cheerfully greeting customers. Outside, the Chicago wind cut through the frosty air as though winter intended to linger forever. Midway through his shift, Frank caught sight of something unusual, a sleek, black limousine gliding down the street toward the cafe. Such vehicles rarely ventured into this modest neighborhood. He paused in the middle of steaming milk, transfixed by the glossy car as it pulled up across the road. "Frank?" Darlene prompted, nudging him out of his trance. She handed him a latte order. "Don't let that fancy car distract you. We've got thirsty customers waiting." He returned his focus to the task, swiftly completing the drinks, but his curiosity lingered. Between handing cups to patrons, he glanced repeatedly out the window, wondering if whoever was inside the limousine would exit. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, the driver stepped out and opened the back door. Frank couldn't quite see who emerged before the door swung shut. While he tried to shake off the sense of intrigue, a familiar face walked in through the cafe entrance. Gerald Sullivan, an accomplished chef who'd once worked with Frank's Uncle Marcus, offered a broad grin. At 42, he was tall and carried himself with an air of self-assurance that came from years of success in Michelin-starred restaurants. "Frank Moore," Sullivan said, removing his gloves as he approached the counter. "It's been a while. Last time I saw you, you were barely out of high school, helping Marcus prep in that tiny bistro on the south side." Frank smiled, memories flashing of late nights in that bustling kitchen. "Good to see you, Mr. Sullivan. I didn't know you still kept in touch with my uncle." Sullivan nodded. "He speaks highly of you, told me you're juggling 2 jobs, culinary school, the works." With a proud grin, Frank handed Sullivan a fresh espresso. "On the house," then he leaned closer, eager for career insights. "I'm trying to get my foot in the door, but money's an issue." Sullivan sipped thoughtfully. "Marcus always said you had grit. Take it from me, though. There's more to success than just raw talent. Keep your eyes open for bigger opportunities." Their conversation was interrupted by Darlene tapping Frank's shoulder. "You might want to look outside," she whispered. "That limousine's back." And someone important-looking just stepped out. Frank glanced toward the street. The same long black car, now idled directly in front of the cafe, drawing curious gazes from passers-by. A moment later, the door opened, and out stepped Anne Murphy, elegantly dressed in a navy blue tailored suit. Her hair, a light brown neatly pulled into a low chignon, contrasted with the bright green eyes that Frank remembered from the station. Draped over her arm was a familiar wool coat. His coat. Heart pounding, Frank nearly spilled the espresso he was making. He hurriedly wiped his hands and moved toward the entrance as Anne walked in, scanning the space until her eyes settled on him. "Hi," she said softly, extending the coat. "I believe this belongs to you." He took it, stunned. I never thought I'd see you again. Are you all right?" She offered a small, polite smile. "I'm fine. Thanks to your kindness. I wanted to return this personally." Their exchange drew the attention of Sullivan and a few nearby customers. Feeling self-conscious, Frank cleared his throat. "Well, I'm glad it helped." He paused, unsure how to continue. "Can I get you something?" Before Anne could answer, Sullivan recognized her. Anne Murphy, if I'm not mistaken, Murphy Investments. He gave a half bow, half nod, as if greeting royalty. Gerald Sullivan. We crossed paths at a charity function last year. Anne smiled politely, but kept her attention on Frank. A coffee would be great. Maybe we could sit and talk for a moment. She glanced around the bustling cafe. If you have time? Frank, trying to steady his nerves, nodded and gestured for her to pick a table near the window. As she brushed past him, with an air of quiet confidence, 1,000 questions raced through his mind. The driver waiting outside, the crisp suit, the name Murphy that he recalled from the newspaper, it all pointed to a life drastically different from his own. Yet here she was, choosing to walk into his world again, uninvited and entirely unexpected. Seated at a small table in the corner of Lakeview Cafe, Anne and Frank faced each other over 2 steaming mugs. Around them, morning customers filtered in, placing orders for pastries and lattes. But for Frank, the hustle seemed to fade into the background. His attention locked on the poised woman across from him. "You really didn't have to come all this way," he said. "I appreciate you returning the coat, though." Anne, smoothing her suit jacket, glanced at the coat draped over the back of her chair. It felt wrong not to. "Besides, the gesture you showed that night, it was something I'm not used to, simple kindness, with no agenda." He felt a flush creeping over his cheeks. "It was nothing. You were cold." She gave him a measured look. "It wasn't nothing to me." After a pause, she continued, "I should also explain who I am. My father is Thomas Murphy, CEO of Murphy Investments. We have extensive business interests. That's why the Limousine—" Frank took in this revelation, remembering the name from that newspaper article. He struggled to reconcile the woman who'd shivered at Union Station with the refined corporate heiress sitting before him now. "I see. That's, quite a world you come from." Anne allowed a wry smile. "It can be." She lifted her coffee. "You're studying culinary arts, right? Did I hear you mention that the other night?" He nodded. "Yes, at the Chicago Culinary Institute. I also work here and at Bellini's, trying to save up enough to open my own restaurant someday." Her eyes sparkled with genuine interest. "A restaurant? Have you worked out a concept?" Frank hesitated, suddenly aware of how big his dream must sound to someone so well connected. "I call it Raíces. It's a way to honor my family's Italian and American roots," he said, opening his phone to show her a photo of his sketches. "Seasonal menu, fresh local ingredients, a place that feels both innovative and welcoming." Anne studied the image intently. "That's quite detailed," she remarked, nodding thoughtfully. "And you're financing this all on your own?" He let out a humorless laugh. "I'm trying, but it's slow. Tuition alone eats most of what I earn. Then there's rent, bills, you name it." She pursed her lips, setting her coffee down. "What if you had a partner? An investor who believed in your vision?" Caught off guard, Frank's eyes flicked up to hers. "An investor? You mean, like you?" Anne shrugged, trying to maintain an air of nonchalance. "Potentially, yes, if it made sense. I've been looking for a meaningful project of my own to invest in, something beyond the standard corporate ventures. When I learned your name from your cafe badge, I did a little research. You were in a regional cooking contest last year. Your dishes received quite a buzz online." Frank felt warmth and unease in equal measures. "I didn't make it past the semi-finals, but it was a good learning experience." "That's more than most people ever attempt." Anne leaned forward, her voice low and earnest. "Look, I know this might sound sudden, but your passion is obvious. You took the time to help a stranger in the cold. You're juggling multiple jobs to keep your dream alive. That says something about your character." Frank's mind raced. He was flattered and suspicious, But why? People from your background don't usually show up offering handouts to strangers. She tilted her head. Who said anything about a handout? I'd see it as an investment, which means I'd expect a return. But I also have personal reasons for wanting to get more involved in culinary ventures. And she paused, choosing her words carefully. I like the idea of backing someone genuine. For a moment, the chatter of the cafe seemed to disappear. Frank stared at his mug, swirling the coffee absently. Partnership with Anne Murphy could be the break he'd been praying for, but it also felt like stepping into a realm he'd never anticipated. Darlene, wiping a nearby table, caught Frank's eye and flashed him a grin. She clearly sensed the chemistry between them. Frank glanced back at Anne, pulse pounding with excitement and caution. I'm not sure what to say. This is huge. Anne smiled gently, pushing a stray hair behind her ear. Think about it. Take your time. I'm not asking for an answer today. She glanced at her watch. But if you'd like to continue this conversation, I'll be at Murphy Towers tomorrow. We can discuss details, no pressure. The following afternoon, Frank stood at the base of Murphy Towers with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The sleek skyscraper loomed over downtown Chicago, the company's name emblazoned on a glossy plaque near the entrance. People in tailored suits hustled in and out, and the polished marble lobby gleamed with corporate prestige. It was worlds away from the cozy familiarity of Lakeview Cafe or the chaos of Bellini's kitchen. Clutching a folder of notes and sketches for raíces, Frank approached the reception desk. A polished attendant offered a courteous smile. Welcome to Murphy Investments. May I help you? I have an appointment with Anne Murphy, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. After checking a digital schedule, the attendant directed him to the 37th floor. The elevator ride up felt surreal. Each ding brought him closer to a realm of wealth and power he'd never witnessed so closely. When the doors slid open, Frank stepped onto plush carpeting and took in the lofty reception area. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a breathtaking view of Chicago's skyline. He was barely seated in a minimalist waiting lounge when Anne appeared, wearing a tailored blouse and pencil skirt. Frank, she said warmly, gesturing for him to follow. I'm glad you came. She led him through a corridor of glass-walled offices. Eventually, they arrived at a sleek conference room. At the head of a long glass table stood Lawrence Chapman, the CFO of Murphy Investments. He was 53, balding, with a sharp gaze that assessed Frank with cool detachment. Mr. Moore, Chapman greeted, extending a quick handshake. Anne speaks highly of your culinary ambitions. Shall we get started? Frank swallowed, nodding as he sat. The conference room overlooked Lake Michigan, sunlight reflecting off the water. Anne settled beside him, while Chapman took a seat across, opening a thin folder. We have a vacant property that might interest you. A space on West Randolph. Good foot traffic, up-and-coming area for restaurants. Anne believes it could house your concept. Frank's heart leapt. He'd spent countless hours dreaming of a location, but he'd never dared imagine a prime downtown spot. That sounds perfect, he said, voice tinged with excitement. Obviously, we'd cover substantial costs, Chapman continued. Construction, initial staffing, equipment. In exchange, Murphy Investments would hold partial ownership and a share of future profits. Frank nodded, trying to appear composed. This was precisely the opportunity he'd thought impossible. But amid his elation, a current of caution ran through him. Business deals at this level involved complexities he barely understood. Anne, sensing his apprehension, gently placed a hand on his arm. We can talk the details through, she assured, and you'll have time to review everything. Chapman's phone buzzed. Interrupting the moment, he glanced at the screen, frowned, and stepped out to take the call. Alone with Anne, Frank exhaled. I appreciate all of this, but it's a lot to process. Anne nodded. I know. That's why I wanted you to see the building in person before committing. She pulled a glossy brochure from a folder, flipping through images of a spacious commercial unit. If you'd like, we can go take a look. Just then, a framed photo on a nearby desk caught Frank's eye. Anne, dressed elegantly, standing beside a handsome man in a tuxedo. The nameplate read, Richard Harrington. He vaguely recognized the Harrington name, an influential banking family. The image stirred a twinge of unease. "Who's that?" he asked softly. Anne's gaze dropped briefly. "Richard Harrington," she said in a measured tone. It's complicated. Our families have been close for years." He sensed there was more to the story, but her expression warned him not to pry. Trying to move on, he asked, "So, this property on Randolph, if I accept, how soon would we start?" "Potentially within weeks," Anne replied. "I'm serious about supporting your dream, but if you're not comfortable, I'd understand." Before Frank could respond, Chapman re-entered, his cool composure restored. "Sorry about that, Ms. Murphy. Mr. Murphy wants to confirm you'll attend the Harrington event next week." He paused, glancing at Frank. "We can finalize the documents if you decide to proceed, Mr. Moore." The mention of a Harrington event made Frank wonder just how intertwined Anne's life was with this powerful social circle. He nodded politely, trying to hide his nerves. "I'll need a little time," he said. "I want to do this right. Go over the terms, run the numbers." Anne stood, offering a reassuring smile. "Take whatever time you need. In the meantime, let me show you that space. It might help you visualize how Raíces could look." They left the tower together, stepping onto the bustling city street. Frank clutched his folder tightly, adrenaline pumping through his veins. This was the biggest opportunity he'd ever had, a lifeline toward his restaurant dream. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the glamorous world of Murphy Investments might demand more than he could safely give. That evening, Frank headed straight to his Uncle Marcus's apartment in Pilsen, determined to lay out Murphy Investments' proposal. He found Marcus at the kitchen table, nursing a mug of herbal tea, arthritic hands wrapped around the warmth. Without preamble, Frank explained everything, from Anne's sudden reappearance to the vacant property on West Randolph. He spoke rapidly, excitement and anxiety tangling in his words. Marcus listened intently, nodding but not interrupting. When Frank finished, his uncle exhaled slowly. "That's some offer, but you know the saying, if something seems too good to be true." Frank's shoulders sagged. "Yeah, I know. But it might be the only shot I have at opening Raíces in the next few years. I can't keep saving pennies forever." Marcus gazed at him with a fatherly softness. "I just want you to be careful. Money from people like the Murphys often comes with strings." Meanwhile, across town, Anne stood in her father's expansive office on the top floor of Murphy Towers. Thomas Murphy, 65, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, even as his health showed signs of frailty, fixed her with a stern look. "You're investing company funds in some unknown barista's dream," he demanded, his tone tinged with disapproval. Anne squared her shoulders. "It's a good opportunity, Father. The culinary scene in Chicago is booming. And Frank Moore isn't just a barista, he's a talented chef who could put our name on the map in a new industry." Thomas eyed her, tapping a pen on his mahogany desk. "You have a responsibility to this family's legacy. I hope you're not using business to run from personal obligations." She stiffened but kept her composure. "Richard Harrington and I haven't even set a date yet. I'm not running from anything. I'm diversifying the company's portfolio, which is exactly what you expect me to do." Thomas let out a weary sigh. "Just make sure you know what you're doing. Don't forget your place in this family, Anne." Back in Pilsen, Frank and Marcus's conversation took a different turn as Frank mentioned Anne's personal life. "She's engaged, or at least Everyone seems to think so, he said, recalling the photo of her with Richard Harrington. Marcus arched an eyebrow. An arranged match, maybe. People in high society often do that for business or status. Frank shrugged, uncertain. She was at my apartment earlier for a tasting. She seemed... He paused, remembering how Anne had sampled his homemade pasta sauce with genuine delight. She seemed captivated by the flavors and proud of my work. But whenever I get a glimpse of her world, it's like she's juggling expectations I can't fully understand. Tyler, who had dropped by Marcus's place, chimed in with a theatrical flourish. Dude, you're overthinking. If this Murphy lady wants to invest, say yes. You'll regret it if you let fear hold you back. Marcus shot Tyler a mild glare. It's not that simple. But Frank remained thoughtful. He did fear losing creative control or being used as a pawn in corporate power plays. Later that night, Anne arrived unexpectedly at Frank's modest apartment with a Tupperware of leftover hors d'oeuvres from a charity luncheon. I thought you might want to sample some of the bites we serve at events, she explained, setting them on his tiny kitchen counter. He invited her in, clearing a stack of textbooks and cooking magazines from his small table. The tasting was informal. Frank heated the delicate canapes and offered a few of his own creations in return, improvising with limited ingredients he had on hand. Anne was visibly impressed, her refined palate quick to note each subtle flavor. You've got genuine talent, she said, looking around his cramped space. Imagine what you could do with a real budget and professional equipment. As her phone buzzed repeatedly, calls about an upcoming gala, Frank felt the chasm between their worlds. Still, the conversation flowed easily, both of them sharing personal anecdotes, her strict boarding school upbringing, his love for simple family recipes. When she finally left, the warmth lingering in the small apartment felt almost tangible. Later, as he washed dishes, Frank replayed the evening in his mind. He recognized how quickly their lives diverged the moment she answered her phone. Yet for those brief hours, they'd been just two people sharing a passion for food, and that had felt remarkably real. A few nights later, Frank decided to introduce Anne to the two people who anchored his life, Uncle Marcus and Mrs. Rodriguez. Anne arrived at Marcus's apartment bearing a bouquet of flowers and a bottle of wine. Though the space was humble, a battered couch, time-worn carpets, and a cluttered bookshelf, she seemed perfectly at ease. "Thank you for having me," she said graciously, offering the flowers to Mrs. Rodriguez. "I've heard wonderful things about your cooking, Mom." Mrs. Rodriguez, 70 and lively, flashed a warm smile. "Then you must try my empanadas. But only if you call me Mrs. R. Everyone else does." They settled into the living room. Marcus, stoic about his arthritis, tried to hide his discomfort as he rose to greet Anne. "Marcus Moore," he said simply. "You're the one who wants to help Frank open a restaurant?" Anne shook his hand gently, reading the caution in his eyes. "I do. But I also want to see what you've taught him. He speaks highly of you." A small but genuine grin crossed Marcus's face. "I taught him the basics. The rest he learned on his own." He gestured for her to sit, wincing slightly, as he lowered himself into a chair. "You must come from a very different world than ours." Anne didn't deny it. She glanced around, noting the framed photographs of Marcus and Frank's mother in various kitchens. "Yes, it's different," she replied, carefully choosing her words. "But I admire what you've built here, this sense of family." While Mrs. R. hustled into the kitchen to bring out plates of hot empanadas, conversation turned to Frank's restaurant plans. Anne asked Marcus for advice on decor and menu items, genuinely curious about his opinions. Marcus, cautious but warming, admitted he believed in Frank's potential wholeheartedly. Partway through the evening, Anne's phone buzzed. She silenced it, but gave Frank an apologetic look. "Something for work. I'll get it later." Unbeknownst to them, at that very moment, Thomas Murphy was in his office, meeting with Michael Torres, a private investigator he'd hired. 40-ish, with a guarded expression and the stance of a former police officer, Torres laid out a folder of documents. "Everything on Frank Moore, sir," he said. "Financial records, family history, job references. Nothing criminal. But he's barely keeping his head above water. Plenty of debt from culinary school." Thomas frowned. "Does he have any angle here? Blackmail? Sabotage?" Torres shook his head. "Doesn't look like it. Seems genuinely hard-working." Then, lowering his voice, he added, "But if your daughter is becoming personally entangled with him, that might complicate your other arrangements." Thomas waved a dismissive hand. "Let me worry about that. Just keep an eye on him." "Report anything suspicious." Torres nodded, gathering his papers before slipping out. Meanwhile, back in Pilsen, Anne and Frank finished dinner. Marcus cleared his throat. "So, you think you can help Frank find a place for his raíces?" Anne nodded. "Yes. We already toured one location. It's perfect, though it needs renovation. I believe it could be spectacular." Curiosity piqued. Mrs. R asked, "And what's in it for you, Miss Murphy?" "You'll be his boss." "More of a partner," Anne said, meeting Frank's gaze. "I don't want to stifle his creativity. That's the point of supporting his vision." Marcus studied her carefully. "All right, but be careful. Money has a way of pulling the strings if you let it." They concluded the night on a hopeful note, Anne promising to keep them updated. Frank walked her out into the chilly hallway, where she slipped on her coat. She turned to him, eyes reflecting a mixture of anticipation and something deeper. He swallowed the knot in his throat, wondering how real any of this could become. Just then, a tall, well-dressed man appeared at the far end of the corridor. He stepped forward, looking sharply out of place in the worn building. Richard Harrington, his voice clipped. He greeted Anne with polite tension. "I've been looking for you. Thomas said you were here." A quiet crackle of hostility filled the space. Frank, for once, found himself speechless. Anne, her posture stiffening, introduced them tersely. The tension was palpable. Two men from entirely different worlds, now standing face to face. The following day, Frank was invited to a private meeting at Murphy Towers, this time by Thomas Murphy himself. Arriving in the late afternoon, Frank felt a ball of nerves in his stomach. The imposing, glass-walled office suite on the top floor exuded power. Stepping inside, he found Thomas Murphy seated behind a massive desk. Anne stood off to the side, arms folded, while Richard Harrington lounged in a chair near the window. Thomas, silver-haired and commanding, motioned for Frank to take a seat. "Mr. Moore," he began, voice calm but firm. "My daughter tells me you're an exceptional chef with a restaurant concept worth investing in. I wanted to hear the details from you directly." Clearing his throat, Frank opened his folder. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Murphy. My concept, raíces, focuses on fresh, local ingredients and a fusion of Italian and American traditions." He stumbled over his words slightly, aware of Richard's cool gaze upon him. "Chicago has a rich culinary scene, but I believe we can bring something unique." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Anne and Chapman have shown me projections. While I'm not entirely convinced, I'm willing to entertain the notion." He tapped a set of papers on his desk. "This is a preliminary contract. It offers you full funding for the restaurant space, renovations, and initial operating costs. In return, you'll grant Murphy Investments a stake with certain guarantees." Frank reached for the document, but before he could read more than a few lines, Richard spoke up. However, some modifications seemed necessary, he said, flicking a glance at Anne. We wouldn't want an inexperienced chef running wild with our capital. An uneasy feeling coiled in Frank's gut. Modifications. Thomas handed over the revised version. These changes ensure we protect our investment. If the restaurant fails to meet certain quarterly revenue benchmarks, Murphy Investments can assume full operational control. Also, we'd like to guide decisions regarding menu structure, promotions, and staffing to maintain synergy with our brand. It's business, Mr. Moore. Anne's eyes flashed in disapproval, but her father held up a silencing hand before she could protest. Frank skimmed the document, heart pounding. The language was dense, but the implications were clear. If Raíces didn't perform to corporate expectations, he could lose creative and financial control. This looks different from what Anne and I discussed, Frank said carefully, directing his gaze to her. I was under the impression I'd retain creative independence. Richard shrugged. We're putting up the money. We're entitled to safeguard our interests. Anne finally spoke up, voice tense. Father, we agreed Frank needed autonomy to shape Raíces the way he envisions. That's the whole point, isn't it? Thomas gave her a placating glance. Anne, dear, you're still learning. We must ensure any venture involving Murphy Capital aligns with our company's principles. Then, turning to Frank, he added, If you don't like these terms, you're free to walk away. Frank felt heat rush to his face. His dream was so close, yet the reality was far more constraining. Signing this document meant a shot at success, but also the risk of losing everything if he didn't meet rigid benchmarks. And from what he sensed, Thomas and Richard wouldn't hesitate to pull the rug out from under him if things soured. He glanced at Anne, silently questioning her support. She offered a tiny nod, almost an apology. I didn't know about these changes, Frank. We can negotiate. Richard's smug smile tightened. We're simply protecting you from biting off more than you can chew. Frank closed the folder. I appreciate the offer, but I need time to review this with someone who understands these legal terms. Thomas inclined his head, unruffled. Of course, but don't take too long. Opportunities in this city don't wait. With that, the meeting adjourned. Anne hurried after Frank as he stepped into the hallway. I'm sorry, she whispered, looking genuinely upset. They went behind my back. I can fix this. Frank stared at the skyline beyond the glass walls, mind churning. I don't want to sign my dream away, Anne, yet I'm not sure how else to fund Raíces. She rested a hand on his arm. We'll figure it out. I'll talk to my father. See if we can make the terms fairer. Just don't give up, okay? He nodded stiffly, turning to go. But halfway to the elevator, Lawrence Chapman caught up with him. Mr. Moore, the CFO said quietly, I advise you to think carefully. The Murphy name can launch you to success, or leave you struggling. Sometimes you must compromise to get ahead. Don't be naive. Frank clenched his jaw, stepping into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, he felt torn between desperation and pride. The dream of Raíces shimmered tantalizingly close, yet he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that he might be walking into a deal where he held none of the cards. Frank woke up the next day feeling the weight of the revised contract bearing down on him. He could almost see the clauses in his mind. Revenue benchmarks, forfeiture of creative control, layers of corporate oversight. It didn't feel like the partnership Anne had first described. Determined to get a clearer picture, he called Sofia Mendez, a practical-minded attorney and longtime friend of the family. At 43, she had a reputation for cutting through legal jargon with razor-sharp insight. They met that afternoon at her modest office, a converted townhouse on the north side. The waiting area was lined with shelves full of law books, and a well-worn couch offered visitors a comfortable spot to settle. Sophia ushered Frank into a cozy conference room, pouring him a cup of herbal tea before they began. "Let's have a look," she said, skimming through the contract Murphy Investments had provided. As the minutes ticked by, her expression grew grim. "This is restrictive, definitely not in your favor. If the business shows even a minor slump, they can take over completely." She tapped a highlighted paragraph. "And here, if they deem any of your choices financially risky, they can veto it outright." Frank exhaled, rubbing his temples. "So they'd practically own me the moment sales dip." Sophia nodded. "Their capital would help you open faster than you ever imagined, but the cost, creatively and personally, might be too high." While Frank mulled over these implications, his phone buzzed. He checked the screen to find a text from Anne. "We need to talk. Family issues. I'm sorry about the contract changes." He slipped the phone into his pocket. Anne didn't know her father would push these terms. Sophia's brow furrowed. "I'm sure she's sincere, but you have to protect your interests. You're allowed a counter-proposal, one that ensures you remain in control of your own restaurant." Feeling a bit more empowered, Frank gathered the papers and left. As he stepped outside, the winter wind made him shiver. He still didn't have a proper coat. Marcus's wool coat was at home, drying after a recent snowfall. His old jacket offered little insulation, and the crisp air seemed to echo his anxieties about the future. Meanwhile, Anne was at home, pacing in her elegant high-rise living room. She'd just discovered her father had deliberately altered the contract without telling her, citing corporate prudence. The confrontation with him had been tense. He'd merely shrugged, reminding her that she was still learning the ropes of business deals. Needing an escape, she texted Frank again. They arranged to meet by Lake Michigan, near a small, wind-swept park often deserted in winter. That evening, they stood together on a dock, the wind whipping across the frozen shoreline. The city lights twinkled behind them, a reminder of how close they were to the bustling metropolis and how distant they felt from its certainties. "I'm sorry," Anne said, voice strained. "I didn't know the final contract would be that controlling. I promise I'm trying to fix it." Frank looked down at his gloved hands. "I know, but I can't sign it the way it is. I've always imagined Raíces as mine, you know? A reflection of my family's heritage, my creativity." She nodded, lips trembling from the cold or possibly from pent-up emotion. "I understand. Do you have any other options?" He recounted his meeting with Sophia and the possibility of drafting a counter-proposal. "But your father's not going to like it," he warned gently. Anne brushed aside a strand of hair that had come loose in the icy wind. "He'll have to deal with it, won't he?" She offered a faint smile. "I believe in your dream as much as you do, Frank." That admission, spoken in the hush of a frozen Chicago evening, touched him deeply. For a moment, the tension dissolved, leaving behind a shared sense of possibility. Anne moved closer, so they stood side by side, gazing at the lights reflecting on the water's surface. Words felt unnecessary. The trust growing between them shone brighter than any neon skyline. Just then, Frank's phone buzzed again, this time from Chef Giovanni at Bellini's. "We need to talk more," the text read. "You're done here." A heaviness settled over Frank as he realized that his conflict of interest, pursuing his own venture, had finally prompted Giovanni to fire him. His last reliable paycheck was gone. He stared at the message, grappling with the reality that his safety net had vanished. Yet, as Anne's gloved hand found his in the frigid air, he felt a small surge of hope. Sometimes losing what little you have is the only way to gain something far greater. News of Frank's firing spread quickly among his friends. Tyler, ever the optimist, tried to console him over greasy pizza at a hole-in-the-wall joint in Wicker Park. "One door closes, another opens," Tyler said, folding a slice in half. I know it's cheesy, but you gotta believe it. Frank shrugged, staring at the red-checkered tablecloth. Easy for you to say. You're not the one buried in tuition debt. Still, Tyler's unwavering support buoyed him. You'll figure this out, he insisted. You always do. That afternoon, Frank's heart felt torn in other ways too. He realized how deeply he cared for Anne. Every conversation with her stirred a warm glow of connection, and each shared smile made his pulse quicken. But a voice in the back of his mind warned him he was stepping into a life he didn't understand, a realm of corporate empire, arranged engagements, and paternal demands. Nna, for her part, confided in her best friend, Olivia Chen, a stylish 27-year-old designer she'd met at an exclusive fashion event years ago. Over tea in Olivia's chic studio apartment, Anne spilled her conflicted feelings. I'm supposed to marry Richard, she murmured, fiddling with the ring that symbolized an engagement she hadn't exactly chosen. But I'm drawn to Frank in ways I never expected. Olivia raised an eyebrow. That Harrington deal is your father's brainchild, not yours. Doesn't he always say your personal life is also part of the family's business strategy? Anne grimaced. Yes, but that doesn't make it right. She sighed, her gaze distant. Frank is real. When we talk, I feel seen, and not just for my family name or my worth as an investment. Olivia patted her friend's hand gently. Then maybe it's time you break free from what Thomas Murphy wants. Do what you want. But as if on cue, Anne's phone buzzed with a text from her father, reminding her of an upcoming dinner with the Harringtons. She felt the chains of obligation tighten. She'd also just learned that her father's health had taken a turn. He'd been rushed to the hospital with chest pains, though he insisted it was just stress. Anne's worry conflicted with her anger, leaving her torn between guilt and the need to live life on her own terms. Despite her internal turbulence, Anne attended the culinary competition finals, where Frank was a participant, thanks to a last-minute wildcard entry. Held in a large exhibition hall at the Culinary Institute, the competition drew local chefs and an enthusiastic crowd. Tension filled the air as contestants prepped their stations. Frank felt jittery, newly unemployed, uncertain about his future with Raíces, and grappling with a swirl of emotions for Anne. Yet once he started chopping vegetables, whisking sauces, and plating samples, he slipped into the rhythm of creation. His station featured a signature dish of saffron risotto layered with a winter vegetable medley, a nod to the bright flavors that had once impressed Eliza Townsend. Anne arrived midway through, quietly taking a seat in the stands. She noticed Richard Harrington standing near the VIP area, chatting casually with others, his polished demeanor a stark contrast to Frank's earnest intensity. When Richard spotted her, he offered a possessive wave, as if to remind everyone, including Frank, of where Anne belonged. But Anne's attention remained on Frank. She watched the determined set of his jaw, the confident way he handled ingredients, and the flicker of relief when a panel of judges sampled his dish with approving nods. Tyler, cheering from the crowd, flashed a thumbs up every time Frank looked his way. Even Madame Laurent appeared, leaning against a pillar with a faint smile of pride. When the judging concluded for the day, Frank caught Anne's eye. For a breathless moment, they simply gazed at each other. In that second, everything else faded, the competition, the audience, even Richard's presence. Yet, in the back of Frank's mind, a warning bell rang. Thomas Murphy's looming expectations, the potential heartbreak if Anne returned to her fiancé, and the precarious future of his restaurant dream weighed heavily on him. Despite the friction, a spark of hope flickered. Anne offered a gentle smile, a silent reassurance that she stood with him. Neither knew what tomorrow would bring, but in that shared glance, it felt like they were forging a small corner of the world that belonged only to them. Winter unleashed its fury upon Chicago in a way the city hadn't seen in decades. Streets were buried under mountains of snow, public transportation stalled, and city officials declared a state of emergency. Frank had planned to meet Anne at the potential site for Raíces, but neither expected the weather to turn so dire so quickly. The building was an old brick structure in the West Loop, once a warehouse, now an empty shell waiting for renovation. They arrived around midday, greeted by swirling flurries that stung their faces. Anne's driver hesitated to leave them there, but she insisted she'd call if needed. Within moments of stepping inside, the snow intensified, whiting out the windows and sealing them off from the outside world. "Wow," Frank murmured, peering through the large glass panes. "Can you even see the street?" Anne shook her head, brushing snow off her coat. "Nothing but white." She tried calling her driver, but the call wouldn't connect. "Great. Either the network's overloaded, or the storm is messing with the signal." Frank exhaled slowly. "We might be stuck for a while." The building, half gutted, offered minimal heat. He led Anne toward a corner where some of the old radiators still functioned. The dim interior smelled of dust and fresh plaster, a blank canvas for what could become Raíces. "Guess we'll make the best of it," Anne said, eyeing a stack of dusty chairs. They dragged two over near the radiator and settled in. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the glass. In the muffled silence of the cavernous space, their voices echoed eerily. Frank removed his gloves, trying to rub warmth back into his fingers. "Hardly how I imagined showing you the future restaurant," he joked wryly. Anne offered a gentle smile. "I'm just glad you're here. Let's imagine what this place could be." She gestured around, describing an open kitchen concept, maybe a rustic bar along the back wall, and a front area with communal tables. Frank's eyes lit up as he chimed in about lighting, decor, and a signature herb garden near the windows. Soon enough, their conversation deepened. They spoke of dreams unfulfilled, the burdens of family, and the unexpected connection that had formed between them. With the storm raging outside, there was no audience, no one to judge or interrupt. Their words were honest and unguarded, and confided details she'd never fully shared. Her father's declining health, his insistence that she marry Richard for the sake of uniting two powerful families, and her fear that she'd become just another cog in a carefully orchestrated corporate machine. Frank opened up about his late parents, how cooking was his way of keeping their memory alive, and his fear that taking Murphy money might compromise the authenticity of Raíces. At one point, Frank noticed Anne shivering. He found a heavy tarp that construction workers had left behind, wrapping it around her shoulders like a makeshift blanket. Her eyes shimmered in the soft light. "Thank you," she murmured, "for everything." A hush fell between them. Slowly, almost tentatively, Frank reached for her hand. The warmth of her palm against his, even in the frigid building, felt electric. She drew closer, the air thick with an unspoken longing. When their lips finally met, it was gentle and searching, a moment long in the making. Outside, the storm thundered on, indifferent to the fragile new bond forming within those walls. They clung to each other as if that connection might shield them from every worry beyond the swirling snow. Before they could fully process what was happening, Anne's phone vibrated against the chair. The screen flashed a missed call from her father's office. Moments later, a text came through. "Your father has been taken to the hospital. Mild heart attack. Conditions stable." Anne gasped, tears springing to her eyes. He's in the hospital again." Guilt and concern warred on her features. "I have to go." Frank helped her stand, a wave of anxiety crashing over him too. Their sweet moment of closeness dissolved into urgency. They huddled by the window, straining to see if any vehicle could navigate the snowy streets. Eventually, after several frantic calls, Anne's driver managed to inch his way through the blizzard to collect her. Frank walked her to the door, reluctant to part under such circumstances. "Let me know if you need anything," he said, voice tight with concern. She nodded, pressing her trembling lips together. Then she was gone, bundled into the car. In the silent wake of her departure, Frank stood alone in the echoing space, realization settling heavily upon him. Their first kiss was overshadowed by life's looming complications, Thomas Murphy's fragile health, the contract's demands, and the risk of heartbreak for them both. 2 days passed before Frank heard from Anne. She texted updates about her father's condition, stable but still in the hospital. Worried for her, Frank tried to focus on the upcoming culinary competition, now in its final phase. He immersed himself in perfecting a complex dish, a deconstructed tiramisu that showcased both traditional flavors and modern plating. This was his last chance to make a name for himself outside the Murphy deal. In a parallel development, Michael Torres, the private investigator Thomas had hired, dug deeper into Frank's background. Late one evening, Torres entered Thomas Murphy's office carrying a new dossier. "Mr. Murphy," he said, setting the folder on the desk. "I've done more digging. Frank Moore has no skeletons, just significant student debt. Nothing suggests he's after your family's fortune." Thomas flipped through the pages with a steely expression. "Keep monitoring. I need to be sure." Meanwhile, at a different corner of the city, Anne confronted Richard Harrington in a high-end restaurant's private lounge. She'd learned from her friend Olivia that Richard had a long-standing relationship with another woman, a tidbit widely rumored among Chicago's elite. When pressed, Richard shrugged. "Anne, these arrangements aren't unusual in our circles. Our marriage would be about business. You can live your life, and I'll live mine." Anne felt her stomach turn. "That's not what I want," she said, removing the engagement ring and placing it on the table between them. "I'm done pretending." Richard's polished demeanor cracked for just a second, revealing annoyance. "Suit yourself," he muttered. "But good luck convincing your father this is a smart move." Not long after, Anne arrived at the culinary competition venue, finding Frank among the bustling atmosphere of camera crews and excited onlookers. The final round was open to the public, and local media outlets were there to capture the next rising star. Anne spotted Tyler cheering from the sidelines, camera phone in hand. Nearby, Madame Laurent stood with her arms crossed, exuding a strict but proud aura. Frank's station was a flurry of activity, cream whipping, coffee syrup reducing, chocolate dust sprinkling. He tried to center himself, channeling the memory of his mother's kitchen and the timeless joy of creating something beautiful from raw ingredients. With precise motions, he laid out the dessert components on a sleek white plate. When the judges made their rounds, Frank presented his dish, a layered tribute to Italian-American flavor, melding his family heritage with contemporary flair. The panel of culinary experts tasted carefully, each delivering their critique in hushed tones. Though they maintained a professional detachment, Frank could see sparks of delight in their eyes. The tension soared when the head judge took the microphone to announce the results. After a dramatic pause, he called Frank Moore as the winner. Applause erupted. Tyler whooped loudly, pumping his fist in the air. Madame Laurent offered Frank the barest hint of a respectful nod, and Anne, standing just behind the crowd, felt her heart swell with pride. Cameras flashed as Frank was handed a modest cash prize and a small trophy. Though the monetary award wouldn't fully fund Raíces, the exposure was invaluable. Chef Giovanni, lurking in the background, scowled but offered no congratulations, while several onlookers whispered about Frank's potential next move. In the midst of the celebration, Marcus approached, gripping a wooden cane for support. His eyes shone with emotion. Pulling Frank aside, he quietly confessed a piece of family history. Thomas Murphy. He was an investor in my old restaurant. After a personal dispute, He pulled out without warning, leaving me bankrupt. Frank felt his stomach drop, remembering the contract demands. So he deliberately ruined you. Marcus's gaze drifted. I'll never know if it was personal or just business, but watch your step. At that moment, Anne found them. Her face was pale but resolute. Taking Frank's hand, she led him away from the crowds. Richard admitted everything, she said, voice trembling with a mix of anger and relief. It's over between us. She paused, letting out a shaky breath. I'm telling my father I can't go through with it. Frank squeezed her hand, feeling both alarm and admiration. This was a massive gamble for her, especially given Thomas's precarious health. Yet, as he studied her determined expression, he knew she wouldn't be swayed. The path ahead might be fraught with powerful enemies and uncertain outcomes, but their bond, forged in quiet moments of trust, seemed stronger than ever. That evening, Anne stood at her father's bedside in the hospital, heart pounding. Thomas Murphy looked frail, propped up by pillows, intravenous lines running to his arm, yet his eyes remained as sharp as ever. I've decided, she began, summoning courage from every fiber of her being. I won't marry Richard. I'm sorry if this upsets you, but it's my choice. Her father's gaze hardened. You've always been impulsive, Anne. You failed to see the bigger picture. This union was a strategic alliance. His words rang cold in the sterile hospital room. Anne took a shaky breath. He's been unfaithful from the start, Father, and more importantly, I can't live a life dictated by corporate deals. Thomas's lips tightened. If you do this, I'm cutting you off. No more family trust, no more executive position at Murphy Investments. We'll see how long you last. Anne felt tears threaten, but blinked them back. If that's the consequence, so be it. She turned and left, her heels clicking on the polished floor. Outside the room, she paused to gather herself, the weight of her father's ultimatum pressing down like a heavy cloak. Meanwhile, across town, Lawrence Chapman cornered Frank in the lobby of Lakeview Cafe. The CFO's typically composed demeanor had a note of menace. Mr. Moore, he said quietly, Thomas is displeased. There are ways we can make life difficult for you. Student debt, Uncle Marcus's shaky financial history, negative press, sign the contract as is or walk away and lose everything. Frank's spine stiffened, adrenaline racing. Is that a threat? Chapman smiled coolly. It's an observation. You need us, but we don't need you. Think carefully before making a final decision. After the unsettling exchange, Frank retreated into the cafe, where Darlene was restocking pastry cases. Spotting his shaken expression, she pulled him aside. What happened, hun? He explained the near blackmail he faced, how Murphy Investments could ruin him financially, how they were pressuring him to bend to their will. Darlene listened intently, then offered an unexpected suggestion. I've been thinking of expanding Lakeview into a more substantial eatery, offering dinner options, maybe a small bar in the evenings. If you're interested, we could become partners. A flicker of hope lit Frank's face. Darlene, you can't be serious. That would take a lot of capital. She shrugged. I've saved for years. Not enough for a grand restaurant, but enough to start something modest. You'd be the head chef, we'd share the load, maybe bring in a few local investors. Pausing, she gave him a kind but firm look. Money might be tight, but at least no one would own your soul. Frank swallowed hard, warmed by her faith in him. I appreciate the offer. Let me think it through. Later that night, Anne and Frank secretly met at a quiet cafe in Andersonville, far from the upscale areas where tabloids or corporate spies might lurk. Warm lamps cast soft light on wooden tables, the faint sound of jazz drifting through speakers. Anne explained her father's threat to disinherit her. Frank told her about Chapman's intimidation. They faced each other, the magnitude of their entwined dilemmas nearly overwhelming. "I can't bear the thought of you losing everything because of me," Anne whispered. "If you're tied to Murphy Investments, they'll control you. But if you walk away, where does that leave your dream?" Frank reached for her hand. "Darlene offered a small partnership at Lakeview. It's not Raíces, but it's a start. We could grow it, prove ourselves, together." Tears welled in Anne's eyes. "And what about my father? He'll never accept us. He'll see me as a traitor. I can't watch him deteriorate from stress." A contemplative hush fell between them. Then Anne spoke words that shocked Frank to the core. "Maybe we should leave. Just get out of Chicago for a while. Start fresh in another city, somewhere my family's influence can't reach. We can open a restaurant on a smaller scale, far from these tangled obligations." Frank's breath caught. Running away had never crossed his mind. Chicago was all he knew, his home, his family's resting place, the source of his passion for cuisine. Yet looking into Anne's desperate eyes, he felt the allure of escape from a web that seemed impossible to untangle. He tightened his hold on her hand, heart pounding with conflicting emotions. Could they truly abandon everything and forge a new path? Or would leaving Chicago mean forfeiting the very roots, his raíces, he'd fought so hard to honor? Frank sat at his small kitchen table, eyes fixed on the hastily scribbled notes outlining various scenarios. A single lamp illuminated the cramped apartment, casting shadows that loomed larger on the walls. Sleep had eluded him all night. He kept reliving Anne's offer, an escape from Chicago, and replaying his conversation with Darlene about possibly expanding the cafe. Both paths contained promise, yet also risks that made his heart pound. He remembered his last talk with Marcus earlier that evening. His uncle's warning echoed, "Thomas Murphy destroyed my restaurant once. If you tie your dreams to that family, don't be surprised if they try to control you too." Marcus had also revealed details of how Thomas's abrupt withdrawal of funding had been orchestrated out of spite, causing Marcus's business to collapse. The revelation left Frank with a gnawing sense of dread. Early the next morning, Frank received a call from Gerald Sullivan, the old friend of Marcus who had mentored him. They met in a quiet corner of a bakery near the river. Steam rose from 2 mugs of black coffee as Sullivan leaned in, his voice hushed. "Sometimes," he said, "refusing the thing we want most is the only way to protect who we are." He explained that in the culinary world, there were always offers that looked golden but came with hidden shackles. "Your dream should remain yours," Sullivan emphasized, "not a pawn in a corporate game." Leaving the bakery, Frank felt equal parts grateful and unsettled. Another voice, this time from his own heart, reminded him of Anne. Was loving her part of the dream, or did that risk becoming ensnared in Thomas Murphy's grip? The notion of taking everything he and Anne shared and simply fleeing the city both thrilled and terrified him. That afternoon, Thomas Murphy called an emergency board meeting at Murphy Towers. Though still hospitalized, he phoned in via conference call, delivering a single bombshell. He intended to revise his will and his holdings. Anne, who joined remotely from the hospital corridor, listened in horror as her father declared that any family member refusing to honor long-standing commitments would be written out entirely. Though he didn't mention Anne by name, everyone knew who he meant. The subtle threat hung in the air like a cold draft. "Shaken," Anne texted Frank. "He's rewriting everything, says I'll have nothing if I don't follow his plan." Frank read the message with a sinking feeling. His decision now felt even more impossible. Stand by Anne and watch her be disinherited, or walk away so her father's wrath might relent. That same night, Frank sat on his sofa, the city's lights blinking through the frosty window. Marcus had gone to bed hours ago, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Frank thumbed through the old sketches for raíces. He pictured himself standing in a gleaming kitchen, pouring his soul into each dish, then imagined Anne at his side, championing his vision. That daydream collided with the memory of her father's threats, the cutthroat contract, and the heartbreak that might follow. In a burst of resolve, Frank decided to do what he believed was best for Anne, no matter how deeply it wounded him. If walking away spared her from losing her inheritance and her father's acceptance, perhaps that was an act of love in itself. He texted Anne, "Meet me at Union Station tonight. I need to talk." His fingers trembled after hitting send. She replied within seconds, agreeing to come. Later, in the grand hall of Union Station, where their paths had first truly crossed, Frank stood beneath the vaulted ceiling, clutching the wool coat he'd once lent her. The echoes of announcements mingled with the distant clatter of trains. Anne arrived, breathless and anxious. The moment she saw his solemn expression, tears sprang to her eyes. "I can't let you sacrifice everything for me," Frank whispered, handing her the coat. His voice faltered. "I can't. I won't be the reason you lose your father and your future. You deserve better." She choked back a sob. "Frank, no. We can figure out another way." He shook his head, pressing the coat into her arms as if returning a cherished memory. "I'm sorry," he murmured, voice breaking. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the vast station. The final sight of her tearful face seared itself into his mind, an image of heartbreak wrapped in the coat that had once brought them together. In the days following their painful farewell at Union Station, Frank threw himself into work to numb his grief. True to her offer, Darlene welcomed him as a partner at Lakeview Cafe. They spent countless hours after closing time, sketching out potential evening menus and small expansions. Frank's eyes were hollow but determined. He wouldn't let heartbreak derail his dreams. Still, at odd moments, his thoughts drifted to Anne, an ache echoing in each memory. Anne, meanwhile, appeared to fall back into her old routine of accompanying her father to his appointments and temporarily bowing to his demands. But behind the scenes, she met with her friend Olivia and quietly set plans in motion. She began to gather what resources she could from her personal accounts, selling a few valuables to create a small fund of her own. The heartbreak of losing Frank spurred her resolve to stand on her own feet if necessary. Marcus, angered by Frank's sudden decision to split from Anne, marched down to Murphy Towers. Despite his aching joints, he confronted Thomas Murphy in the executive suite, surprising the staff by barging in unannounced. Thomas, still weak from his hospital stay, looked outraged but also taken aback by Marcus's audacity. "You ruined my career once," Marcus growled, leaning heavily on a cane. "Now you've hurt my nephew too. I know you orchestrated that contract and have been threatening him. Let me warn you, Frank may have stepped aside, but he's no coward. He'll find success, with or without your precious money." Thomas tightened his mouth in a grim line. "Take care how you speak to me. You have no idea what's at stake here." Marcus squared his shoulders. "I've lived enough years to see what matters: family, integrity, and decency. You're driving away your own daughter, and you can't even see it." His words hung in the air, unchallenged, before he turned and left, leaving Thomas fuming in silence. That same week, Anne paid a discreet visit to Mrs. Rodriguez in Pilsen. Marcus's neighbor greeted her warmly and insisted Anne sit for a cup of herbal tea. Though they barely knew each other, Mrs. Rodriguez sensed the young woman's sorrow the moment she stepped through the door. "Tell me what troubles your heart, dear," Mrs. Rodriguez said gently. Anne confessed the basics: how her father was pressuring her, how she'd lost the man she truly cared about, and how she felt trapped between filial duty and personal happiness. The wise widow offered a comforting pat on Anne's hand. "Sometimes love requires patience," she said, "but it also requires courage. If you truly believe in each other, find a way to fight for that bond. Sacrifice is part of love, yes, but it shouldn't destroy you." The next day, Frank found an old news article pinned to the cafe's door. The headline declared, "Murphy-Harrington wedding postponed indefinitely." A grainy photograph showed Anne and Richard at a gala, stiffly smiling. The short blurb mentioned personal reasons for the delay. Reading those words, Frank felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. Had Anne truly walked away from her father's plan? Or was she forced to postpone because of Thomas's health? Darlene stepped out to see him staring at the article. Her gaze flickered with empathy. "Maybe it's a sign," she offered quietly. Frank shrugged, trying to mask his emotions. Or maybe it's just more drama in that world. Yet all day, the thought of Anne weighed heavily on his mind. He wanted to call, to see how she was coping, to tell her that his decision at Union Station was meant to protect her, not to push her into a life of lonely compliance. But he held back, convinced that his presence would only add pressure and heartbreak. Back in her father's townhouse, Anne stared at her phone in the dim glow of a bedside lamp, heart pounding. Frank's name blinked in her contacts, but she couldn't bring herself to press call. For the moment, their worlds spun separately, each caught in a tempest of sorrow and stubborn love. 3 months later, Chicago's harsh winter finally gave way to a subdued spring. The slush-laden streets dried, and budding flowers dotted the city parks. During this transitional season, Frank channeled all his energy into transforming Lakeview Cafe's menu. He introduced artisan sandwiches at lunchtime, experimental soups for evenings, and even tested out a rotating chef's special that showcased his creative flair. Word spread through the neighborhood, drawing curious locals eager to taste the new dishes. Amid this small-scale success, Frank found renewed purpose. Local blogs started praising the reinvented Lakeview, with some calling Frank a hidden gem. Though it wasn't Raíces, the cafe began to flourish. Darlene beamed whenever she recounted the growing profits, yet Frank's heart still carried an Anne-shaped void he couldn't quite fill. Meanwhile, Anne negotiated her future with a steely resolve Thomas Murphy rarely witnessed. Tired of boardroom power struggles and paternal decrees, she made it clear she'd take a position in Murphy Investments on her own terms, specifically to manage a philanthropic division. In return, Thomas grudgingly agreed she could invest a portion of her trust fund into personal ventures. It was a compromise, born partly of his weakened health. He'd suffered a more severe heart attack that nearly cost him his life. As he recovered, Thomas found himself less certain of his old ironclad ways. In the midst of these changes, Frank received a surprise visit at the cafe, a group of small investors from the neighborhood. Led by a local businesswoman named Harriet Miller, they admired Frank's work and believed a real restaurant concept, bigger than Lakeview Cafe, could thrive if done with authenticity and modest initial costs. Harriet extended an offer. "We can't give you millions, but we can give you enough to secure a small place, do some renovations, and open the doors." Frank's heart fluttered. He had almost given up on Raíces entirely. Yet here was a chance to build a scaled-down version of his dream. That evening, he sat in the cafe's back storage room, running through cost estimates on his battered laptop. Every line item seemed to confirm that Harriet's proposal, while humble, might just work. A few days later, as he was closing up around dusk, Anne walked in silently. It was the first time he'd seen her in months. She looked the same, yet different, still elegant, but with a quiet self-assurance that hadn't been there before. For a moment, Neither spoke. The hum of the overhead lights and the distant sound of street traffic filled the tension. "Hi," she said softly, stepping closer to the counter. "I heard about the new menu and the good reviews." Her eyes shone with something between pride and longing. Frank swallowed hard, unable to hide his surprise. "Anne," was all he managed. She glanced around, taking in the cafe's new decor touches. "It's wonderful. You've done an amazing job, Frank." He cleared his throat, forcing himself to keep calm. "Thanks. I've been busy, trying to keep my mind off." He trailed off, realizing how much he still cared. From the doorway to the kitchen, Marcus appeared, leaning on his cane. His eyes flicked from Frank to Anne, a hint of sympathy crossing his features. "I'll give you two a moment," he murmured, disappearing back behind the swinging door. A few seconds later, Mrs. Rodriguez's voice could be heard greeting Marcus, indicating she'd also arrived to chat. Alone again, Anne and Frank fumbled for words. Finally, she broke the silence. "I'm in a different place now, Frank. I've negotiated a role at Murphy Investments that allows me some independence. My father and I... Well, we're not perfect, but we're trying." He studied her expression, noting the tension around her eyes. "And what about your engagement?" She gave a small laugh, tinged with relief. "There is no engagement. Officially ended. Richard didn't put up much of a fight, if I'm honest." They stood there, separated by the cafe's counter, the memory of Union Station lingering like a fresh bruise. Frank took a slow breath. "I'm glad you're forging your own path." "You deserve that," Anne nodded. "I just wanted you to know I haven't forgotten us or what we shared." Her voice nearly cracked. "Maybe we can talk when you're ready." A swirl of unspoken questions churned between them, but for the moment, the gentle spring breeze drifting through the door carried a hint of promise, just enough to let them believe that new beginnings might indeed be possible. A week later, Frank finalized negotiations with Harriet Miller and her small network of local investors. Signing the contract felt surreal. Finally, after so many false starts, he had the green light to create a scaled-down version of Raíces. The location would be in Wicker Park, an up-and-coming neighborhood full of independent boutiques and artsy cafes. It wasn't a grand space, but it had character: exposed brick walls, large windows facing a bustling sidewalk, and a tiny patio out back. In tandem, Anne concluded her discussions with Thomas. His second heart attack had sobered him, and though he remained stubborn, he seemed more open to letting her shape her own future. "You're my only child, Anne," he'd said after his hospital discharge. "Perhaps I pushed too hard. Maybe it's time I trust you to choose your path." She agreed to maintain some involvement in the family business, but under terms that let her direct a charitable wing, supporting education, small businesses, and local arts programs. Meanwhile, Darlene and Marcus forged a deeper connection that caught Frank pleasantly off guard. Late one night, he returned to Marcus's apartment to find Darlene and his uncle poring over an old cookbook, shoulders nearly touching. They both jumped at his entrance, but the telltale blush on Darlene's cheeks and Marcus's flustered grin said more than words could. After Frank teased them for a minute, Darlene confessed their growing affection. "We just clicked," she said quietly, her hand resting gently on Marcus's. "I hope that's all right with you." Frank found himself smiling. It's more than all right. Beneath the swirl of drama in his own life, their blossoming romance felt comforting. At the same time, Anne confronted Richard for the last time. Meeting him in a quiet, upscale bar, she returned a final piece of jewelry, a family heirloom ring. Richard, curiously, appeared relieved. "We both know we never had genuine love, Anne," he admitted. "I'm just glad our families aren't forcing it anymore. Take care." With that, He slid the ring into his pocket and left without further protest. By early evening, Frank visited the Wicker Park property, stepping around construction materials and imagining how to convert the space into a cozy dining room, an open kitchen, and a modest bar area. Sure, it was smaller than his original dream, but the bones felt right. He was so focused on visualizing the layout that he almost didn't notice Anne standing in the doorway, quietly watching him. "I heard you got the keys," she said, smiling softly. She wore a light jacket suitable for the milder spring air. "Mind if I see it?" Frank's pulse quickened. He beckoned her in, guiding her through the partially renovated rooms. "Picture a row of tables here," he said, gesturing to a stretch of exposed brick. "And over there, maybe a chef's counter so people can watch the cooking." They navigated piles of lumber and paint cans. Finally, they reached the back patio, which overlooked a narrow alley. Potted plants could line the perimeter, Frank mused, lending a bit of greenery in the summer months. He turned to Anne, expecting her usual curious excitement, but found her gazing at him with an unspoken question in her eyes. "You really did it," she whispered. "Without my father's backing." He nodded. "I found a way. Harriet Miller and a few others are helping. The budget is tight, but it's honest." Silence stretched, charged with feelings left dormant since Union Station. At last, Frank cleared his throat. "I'm sorry about how things ended between us." Anne stepped closer. "You were trying to protect me. I get that now." She hesitated, as though gathering courage. "Frank, there's something you should know. I ended things with Richard completely. And I also convinced my father to allow me partial access to my trust, strictly for personal investments." She paused, watching his reaction. "Don't worry, I'm not here to buy you out. I just want you to know I'm free." Her words hung in the twilight air, stirring both hope and a flicker of fear within Frank. Before he could respond, she added quietly, "I don't want to intrude on your new partnership. But if there's any place for me, personally or otherwise, I'd like to figure that out together." Frank gazed at her, caught between gratitude and longing. This moment felt like the first day of spring after a harsh winter, fragile but full of promise. They decided to meet at the half-finished Rais's site early one morning, free from the usual distractions of phone calls and obligations. Dust motes swirled in the sunlight, streaming through the big front windows. Frank and Anne carried 2 folding chairs inside and placed them near the makeshift counter, a space that would soon become the restaurant's open kitchen. The air buzzed with possibility as they settled in. "I want to be honest about everything," Anne began, her voice echoing slightly in the otherwise empty room. "No more secrets. If we're going to try this again, really try, we need a clean slate." Frank nodded. "Agreed." He swallowed, tracing a crack in the cement floor with his shoe. "My biggest fear has always been losing control of my dream. I can't let what happened to Marcus happen to me, or to us." Anne pulled a folded piece of paper from her bag. "I've invested a small sum, quietly, into your group of local backers. Harriet knows, but she agreed to keep it anonymous, so you'd never feel pressured. I have no voting rights or majority stake. It's more like a silent partnership." Her eyes flicked up, searching his reaction. "I just wanted to support you in some way that wouldn't threaten your independence." Frank blinked, absorbing this revelation. Part of him was taken aback. Another part was touched by her thoughtful approach. "You believed in Raíces enough to invest your own money and not ask for anything in return." She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I believe in you. Besides, I wanted to prove I'm not just Thomas Murphy's puppet." A moment of charged silence followed, broken only by the distant hum of traffic outside. Frank allowed the warmth of her words to sink in. I never stopped loving you," he admitted, voice catching. Ending things was the hardest choice I've ever made, but I thought it was the only way to keep you safe from your father's wrath." Anne reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. "Maybe we can find a path that doesn't involve running or sacrificing everything. My father has stepped back a bit. He's letting me operate more freely. And if he tries to interfere, well, I'm not afraid of him anymore." Just then, they heard the door open, revealing Thomas Murphy himself. Wearing an inconspicuous coat and a reserved expression, he stepped inside. Behind him was Marcus, who seemed just as surprised to see Thomas as Frank and Anne were. Thomas cleared his throat, glancing around the half-renovated space. "I was curious," he said plainly, "about this place my daughter speaks of so highly." His tone held no obvious malice, only weary caution. Turning to Frank, he gestured vaguely. "I tried your cooking at Lakeview Cafe, incognito. It was admirable." Frank exchanged a stunned look with Anne before nodding politely. "Thank you." "We're doing our best to make something special here." Marcus, leaning on his cane, observed the scene with guarded interest. He and Thomas had a decades-old feud that still cast long shadows. Thomas met Marcus's gaze and gave a curt nod, as though acknowledging past misdeeds without fully apologizing. The silence felt loaded with unspoken grievances, but also with a reluctant acceptance of the present moment. Finally, Thomas addressed Anne. "I suppose," he said quietly, "you're your own person now. My health hasn't made me any younger, and I won't pretend I approve of every choice you've made. But," he faltered for a moment, "if this restaurant is truly important to you, I won't stand in the way." Anne's breath caught. Though not exactly an apology, it was as close as her father had ever come to offering acceptance. She squeezed Frank's hand, emotion welling in her eyes. Thomas turned to leave, but paused at the door. "One final thing. Take care of each other. Life's too short." With that, he stepped out into the crisp morning air, leaving them to process the abrupt gesture of détente. A tingling sense of relief flickered through Frank. He looked down at Anne, who stared after her father with tears threatening to spill. Marcus quietly excused himself, following Thomas outside, perhaps sensing the need to let the younger pair have this moment. Turning back to one another, Frank and Anne realized how much had changed. The illusions and manipulations had peeled away, revealing two people willing to love, build, and risk heartbreak on their own terms. Anne exhaled softly, stepping closer. "So, where do we begin?" she asked. Frank's eyes lit with the first genuine smile he'd worn in months. "We begin right here," he said, gesturing to the dusty floors and unpainted walls. "You and me, building raíces and building us, together." Sunlight beamed through the broad front windows of the soon-to-be raíces, stirring dust motes in the air. The old warehouse in Wicker Park had undergone a rapid transformation over the past few weeks. Walls once cracked and bare were now painted in soft, earthy hues that reminded Frank of a warm Tuscan evening. Wooden panels and shelves had been installed, creating a sense of rustic intimacy that matched the vision he'd held onto for so many years. Early that morning, Frank arrived with Uncle Marcus to supervise final touches on the kitchen installation. Marcus, cane in hand, moved carefully across the newly laid floor, wearing a quiet smile that spoke of pride and nostalgia. His arthritis limited some of his mobility, but not his spirit. He trailed his fingertips over the stainless steel counters, letting out a soft whistle of approval. "You've done it," he said to Frank, voice trembling just enough to reveal how moved he was. "This is the kind of place I used to dream about when I was young. You've got the heart for it." Frank's chest tightened with emotion. "You're the one who inspired it," he replied, gently resting a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "I'm just grateful you're here to see it all come together." Shortly afterward, Darlene arrived, carrying a large box of linens. Though still a partner in Lakeview Cafe, She had chosen to invest her time and support in Frank's bigger venture. Ever since she and Marcus had started seeing each other, it felt as if everyone in Frank's orbit had fused into a single, supportive family. She set the box on a table and let out a low whistle. Boy, this place looks fantastic. You'd never guess it was a dusty storage space a few months ago. Couldn't have done it without Harriet Miller and the local investors, Frank acknowledged. But also without you, Darlene. Thank you. Wiping her brow, she teased. Don't get too sappy on me. We've still got silverware to unpack. Anne arrived a bit later, stepping through the front door with careful grace. She wore dark jeans and a simple blouse, no trace of the high-powered corporate suits she sometimes donned. In her arms, she carried a stack of brand-new menus. Setting them on the makeshift counter, she shot Frank a radiant smile. These arrived from the printer this morning, she said, fanning a few out. I took the liberty of including a short paragraph about your family's Italian-American heritage. It's the perfect introduction to what Raíces represents. Frank picked up one of the menus, running a finger across the embossed lettering. Raíces, honoring tradition, embracing innovation. A lump formed in his throat. This was real. All the sketches, all the late-night recipe testing, and every minor setback had led him to this tangible milestone. Anne noticed the moisture gathering in his eyes and touched his arm. We'll open soon, she whispered, voice alive with excitement. Think you're ready? He exhaled slowly. I'm as ready as I'll ever be, but I'm also terrified, if I'm honest. Starting a new restaurant is risky. With a gentle squeeze of his hand, she nodded. Risk is part of living. I'm learning that firsthand. Just then, Marcus and Darlene returned from the back, discussing a potential spot for a small wine rack. Frank and Anne exchanged knowing smiles. It felt good to see their families blending, offering support and lending advice, even if it occasionally came with playful arguments about recipes or decor. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting a golden glow across the sidewalk. The whir of a construction drill sounded from somewhere in the neighborhood, mixing with the hum of city traffic. For a brief moment, Frank paused, taking in the symphony of everyday life. He recognized how far he'd come, from a barista juggling 2 jobs and classes, to a chef on the cusp of launching his own restaurant. His parents' legacy, Marcus's mentoring, Darlene's faith, Tyler's encouragement, and Anne's unwavering belief. All of it had laid the bedrock for this next leap. In that space, amid the smell of fresh paint and the rustle of new linens, Frank felt a quiet thrill. He couldn't deny a flicker of fear, but neither could he ignore the swell of purpose deep in his heart. Raíces was no longer an abstract dream. It was a living, breathing venture, standing on solid ground. A few days before Raíces was set to open, the streets of Wicker Park bustled with spring energy. College students, young professionals, and longtime locals strolled past the newly hung sign, Raíces, painted in warm, inviting colors. Word of mouth spread quickly. A new Italian-American fusion restaurant was coming, helmed by a rising culinary star named Frank Moore. Inside, the final preparations raced toward completion. Frank dashed from the kitchen to the dining area, double-checking details. The open kitchen gleamed under recessed lighting, pots and pans hung in neat rows, and fresh ingredients sat waiting for their grand debut. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. Just 2 more days, he reminded himself, pulse skittering with anticipation. That afternoon, Anne orchestrated a subtle marketing push. She quietly reached out to a handful of influential locals, bloggers, food critics, and even some philanthropic contacts she'd cultivated through Murphy Investments. True to her promise, she did it all behind the scenes, ensuring that Frank remained the restaurant's focal point. He had asked for authenticity, and she intended to respect that. As the staff gathered for a pre-opening briefing, the new team members exchanged nervous smiles. Frank introduced each person. Chef Lucia, 35, with a background in Michelin-starred kitchens, would serve as his second-in-command. James, 42, an experienced server with an encyclopedic knowledge of wines, would be front-of-house lead. Several junior cooks, eager graduates from culinary programs, completed the brigade. "Tomorrow is our final dress rehearsal," Frank announced, rolling his shoulders as though preparing for a marathon. "I want us to walk through every dish, every table setting, every possible scenario. This restaurant stands for unity, tradition, and innovation. Let's honor that with our best." As the meeting ended, Darlene offered a round of applause. "Sounds like we've got ourselves a plan. I'm so proud of you, Frank." Across town, Thomas Murphy made an unannounced visit to Lakeview Cafe. Though still showing signs of recovery, he carried himself with more humility than before. He sampled a house specialty soup, one of Frank's recipes, and spoke quietly with Darlene about the Raíces opening. She sensed a change in him, a weariness that softened his once imperious demeanor. "I suppose," he murmured, "a man learns more from what he nearly loses than from what he always had." That evening, just as the sun began to set, Anne caught up with Frank at Raíces. She found him perched on a stool in the corner of the dining room, a pen in hand and a thick notepad on his knee. In front of him lay the final draft of the opening night menu. "Hey," she said softly, sliding onto the stool beside him. "Mind if I see?" He passed the menu to her. It featured dishes like saffron risotto al limone, homemade gnocchi with seasonal vegetables, and a dessert medley that hinted at Frank's winning tiramisu from the culinary competition. Anne scanned it with delight. "This is brilliant. I see your mother's influence in the tomato base for the gnocchi sauce, and your father's American side in that bourbon-infused glaze for the roasted chicken." Frank's eyes glimmered. "I wanted each plate to tell a story about where I come from and where I'm going." She reached for his free hand, giving it a squeeze. "I'm proud of you. This is everything you talked about back when I first met you at the station, and more." A flicker of concern traced across Frank's face. "I just hope the critics see the heart in it. The restaurant world can be ruthless. If opening night goes poorly—" Anne silenced him with a gentle look. "Whatever happens, you're doing what you love. That's success in itself. Besides, you're not alone." She paused, letting the significance of her words linger. "We're in this together." A sense of quiet reassurance settled over them. Frank inhaled the faint scent of new wood polish, the softness of Anne's perfume mixing in a moment that felt both exhilarating and calm. Tomorrow would be a whirlwind. Press, VIP guests, nerves frayed by the pressure to dazzle. But for now, he and Anne lingered in the hush of possibility, hearts steady and united in purpose. Leaving Raíces that night, Frank flicked off the lights and locked the door. Standing on the sidewalk, he turned to see the glowing sign overhead. In less than 24 hours, this empty dining room would burst with conversation, laughter, and the aroma of good food. He slid an arm around Anne's waist, guiding her gently away, certain that whatever the next day held, they had built a foundation strong enough to endure. Opening night arrived at last, bringing an electric buzz to Raíces. Even before dusk settled, a small crowd gathered outside the door, curious patrons peering through the windows. Inside, the staff moved with practiced urgency, double-checking table settings, adjusting floral arrangements, and ensuring the kitchen ran like a fine-tuned machine. By 7 o'clock, the first guests trickled in. Some were local neighbors, others adventurous foodies who had read about Frank's triumph in the culinary competition. Eliza Townsend, the influential restaurant critic who'd once praised Frank's risotto, appeared dressed in a sleek, navy outfit. She greeted Frank with a polite smile, reminding him that her pen could shape a restaurant's fate. Tyler, brimming with excitement, arrived early to snag a prime seat at the communal table. He waved Frank over. "I'm your personal cheerleader tonight," he joked. "And trust me, half my bar regulars are planning to drop in. Word is traveling fast." Marcus served as a maitre d' for the evening, standing at the entrance in a crisp shirt and blazer, using his cane for support. He greeted each patron with genuine warmth, introducing himself as the uncle of the head chef. Darlene busied herself overseeing the servers and occasionally darting back to the kitchen to check on the pace of dishes. The energy was palpable. Each team member determined to showcase the best of what Raíces could be. In the open kitchen, Frank and Chef Lucia glided around each other in near silence, orchestrating a symphony of sizzling pans and aromatic sauces. Frank plated the saffron risotto with the utmost care, swirling a final drizzle of infused olive oil on top. Every dish felt like a personal statement, a manifestation of the love and labor that had gone into making this night possible. Shortly into the dinner rush, a hush spread across the room as Thomas Murphy himself entered. He walked slowly, his health still fragile, but his presence unmistakable. Anne discreetly approached him, helping him settle at a small corner table. Though father and daughter exchanged few words, the moment felt like a cautious step toward reconciliation. Soon, the dining room brimmed with chatter and the clink of silverware. Plates returned to the kitchen, scraped nearly clean, an encouraging sign. Tyler posted enthusiastic photos on social media, while Harriet Miller, one of the local investors, beamed at the sight of so many satisfied faces. Eliza Townsend, the critic, requested a word with Frank. He emerged from the kitchen, heart pounding. She offered a brief nod, lips curving in a measured smile. "Your risotto has improved since Bellini's," she stated, an almost playful gleam in her eye. "And that's saying something. You're onto something special here." Relief washed over him. "Thank you," he managed, voice tight with emotion. The evening continued, each passing hour bringing new patrons. Madame Laurent even made an appearance, quietly indulging in Frank's gnocchi before cornering him near the kitchen. "I had my doubts about your future," she admitted in her accented English. "But you've proved you can bring artistry and soul to the plate." It was high praise from the notoriously tough instructor. By the time the last dessert was served, a sampler featuring Frank's signature tiramisu twist, the staff was both exhausted and triumphant. Plates returned empty, glasses shimmered with the final drops of wine, and satisfied diners lingered over coffee and conversation. Closing time arrived sooner than Frank expected, and when the final guest departed, a spontaneous round of applause erupted from the staff. Tears glistened in Frank's eyes as he set down his apron. Anne approached him, her own expression brimming with pride and joy. "You did it," she whispered, stepping close. "They loved everything." He took a moment to absorb the scene, the messy kitchen counters, the tired but jubilant team, his uncle leaning against the host stand with a grin that said, "I knew you had it in you." In that instant, Frank felt a surge of gratitude so intense it stole his breath. Here he stood, fulfilling the dream that once existed only on scraps of paper in a cramped studio apartment. His gaze settled on Anne. Without a word, he pulled her into a hug. The hum of the dishwashers, the chatter of the staff, and the swirl of leftover aromas all blurred in the background. This was the moment he'd yearned for, the merging of aspiration and reality. Raíces was alive, and their journey together was only just beginning. 2 years later, Raíces stood firmly on the map of Chicago's vibrant dining scene. Critics hailed it as a must-visit for anyone seeking inventive Italian-American fusion. Locals made it a beloved neighborhood mainstay, especially after the restaurant earned its first Michelin star, a milestone that left Frank speechless and Marcus dancing awkwardly with his cane in the dining room. In that time, Anne and Frank had grown closer than ever. Their partnership extended far beyond the kitchen, weaving through shared triumphs and occasional disagreements. With her philanthropic role in Murphy Investments, Anne supported local culinary education, ensuring young talents had resources Frank once struggled to find. In quieter moments, she photographed the dishes for a cookbook they were co-authoring, a dream that combined her business acumen and artistic flair with Frank's culinary expertise. One crisp winter evening, after service wrapped up at Raíces, Frank locked the restaurant's doors. Snow drifted from the dark sky, coating the sidewalks in a shimmering blanket. Anne waited outside, bundled in a warm coat, her breath turning to mist in the cold air. He joined her, tucking her hand beneath his own. Together, they walked toward Union Station, following a gentle urge to revisit the place where their story had truly begun. The station was quieter at night, echoing with the distant rumble of trains. Under the high-arched ceiling, they stopped near the bench where Frank had once offered Anne his only warm coat. A wave of nostalgia and gratitude washed over them both. Anne traced a finger along the bench's worn edge, remembering how lost she felt that freezing night. Frank turned to her, eyes shining with a soft glow. "I brought something for you," he said, pulling a small gift box from beneath his overcoat. He handed it to her with a grin that betrayed his nervous excitement. Anne opened the box slowly. Inside lay two matching wool coats in a deep charcoal hue, one sized for her, one for him. She lifted the smaller one, running her fingertips over its finely stitched seams. A silver pin on the collar bore the word Raíces in elegant script. "They're a pair," Frank explained, warmth coloring his voice, "so we don't have to face the cold separately anymore." And to remind us of how this all started, tears blurred Anne's vision. She smiled, touched beyond words. Then she noticed a small envelope tucked beneath the coats. Opening it, she discovered a key to Raíces, the only one she'd never possessed, since Frank always said he needed to lock up himself. He gently took the key and placed it in her hand. "You're just as much a part of that place as I am," he said quietly. "I should have given you a key a long time ago." Anne laughed through her tears. "I practically live there anyway." The station's overhead lights cast a gentle glow as they swapped coats, slipping into their new matching wool. Side by side, they fit perfectly, the thick fabric guarding them against the winter chill. Anne pressed close to Frank, her heart pounding with a rush of memories, everything from their first tentative conversation over coffee to the chaotic months of contract battles, heartbreak, and eventual reconciliation. After a few silent moments of shared awe, Frank cleared his throat. "We have one more train to catch," he teased, feigning seriousness. Anne cocked her head. "Oh, where to?" He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a tiny velvet ring box. Opening it revealed a modest but beautifully set diamond. "Wherever life takes us," he whispered, eyes brimming with love and anticipation. "Will you marry me, Anne Murphy?" Her breath caught, tears now freely falling as she nodded. "Yes," she said, barely able to speak the word. 1,000 times yes. Embracing under the station's grand arches, they lost themselves in a moment of pure, quiet joy. Two souls who had braved the cold of life's uncertainties and found genuine warmth in each other. Outside, a train rumbled past, its lights slicing through the snowy night. The future beckoned, filled with dreams they'd chase hand in hand, no longer strangers in a swirling storm. Wrapped in their new coats and the promise of a shared life, Frank and Anne stepped out into the Chicago winter together. Their story, one born of kindness in a freezing station, had come full circle, leaving them stronger, braver, and ready to welcome whatever seasons lay ahead. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.